So earlier this year, I fitted an upgraded oil pump to this twin turbo V8 behind me to test some theories on the factory LS oiling system. I set out to better understand this oiling system because of a major failure I had encountered at the racetrack. Now, in a previous video, I showed the aftermath and also some of the fundamental issues with the OEM oiling system that led to this type of failure. Since then, I realized that while the dry sump is still the ultimate direction for this project, there was an intermediate step that I had skipped over. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know if you think this is a worthwhile upgrade, if you'd be interested in trying it, or maybe you have tried something similar. If you like this sort of video, consider subscribing. Thanks for checking it out. Factory GM Gen 4 oil pump on the left and the Melling 10355 HV oil pump on the right here. Side by side, they look pretty similar, and they are pretty similar. Both G-rotor style pumps, bolted to the front of the engine directly by the crankshaft, so 1-to-1 crank RPM. Both feature the same internal bypass mechanism. Melling does come with a selection of different springs based on bypass pressure you desire. So I currently have the stiffest spring in there now. Let's get these opened up and see what it looks like on the inside. At first glance, they do appear to be very, very similar, and that's because they are, but there's some important subtle differences, so let's look a little closer. So first thing, the two outer covers, they look to be fundamentally the same in design. Seems like the Melling may have coating on it. Interesting rough cast appearance on the inside of the Melling. GM certainly smoother. The housings themselves, again, really, really similar. Just to orient yourself, this is the oil inlet drawn in through here, drawn up into the G-rotor assembly, forced through the top, and this is the outlet or feed to the engine there. Down through here is the bypass point. Outlet pressure would push the relief spring, and we get this circulation bypass back through here into the inlet of the pump. And this is one of the primary mechanisms of aeration. Inlet aeration results in reduced oil pressure and a high RPM application. Looking over at the Melling pump, very, very similar. Maybe some subtle changes in casting and the finish there. Same with the outlet, very, very similar overall. And the bypass assembly, essentially the same in design. Now, I did point out that I do have a stiffer bypass spring in here, so that should help some, pushing that recirculation point higher up into the RPM range. But the important difference is in the actual G-rotor pump assembly itself. Here, the difference becomes more pronounced. The most fundamental difference is the significant difference in thickness or total tooth area on the Melling pump versus the factory GM pump. Basically, the width is going to define how much oil is displaced per revolution. And in this case, the significant difference in thickness is going to proportionally increase the flow capability of this Melling pump. So let's get a measurement on that, see what we're working with. So about 160, just about 170 thousandths difference in thickness. So what this is going to do is a proportional increase in the flow. This Melling pump is going to move more oil per revolution than the factory pump. One other detail with the pump installation, because the body of the pump mounts to the engine block, it must be concentric with the crankshaft. So to do that, using some shim stock based on your pump clearance so that the housing floats appropriately, and then go ahead and snug the bolt down. Oil pan balancer on. Time to go back in the car. Since then, I've put tons of mileage in the car, street driving, racing, all sorts of stuff, and I've seen the expected higher oil pressure across the entire operating range. There were some initial concerns about the high pressure creating issues with things like the oil filter, cartridge style oil filter, or with the turbo seals. These are definitely valid because after performing the upgrade, the engine was idling at approximately 100 pounds of oil pressure, and as the RPM would increase, it would hit 150 psi by 3,000 RPM. So there's no telling how high the pressure was going when I had it spun up to 7,000–8,000 RPM. but suffice it to say that this pump is moving a lot of oil. Overall, I observed no negative impacts to operating with significantly higher than factory oil pressure. In fact, I noticed some interesting improvements in the typical dropping of LS oil pressure at sustained high RPMs, the type of thing you might see at the racetrack. Let's look at the data and see what this really looks like. So this is data collected from a drag strip pass I made. You can see here RPM trace in red. Although oil pressure is seen to rise here with RPM, up to about 80 while on the two-step, as the car launches and RPM climbs up over 8,000, in fact, the oil pressure starts to drop. And again, after the next gear change, back up towards 8,000, it's dropping further, now down to 65 psi. Out another to the top of third gear, it's down to 62 psi. And you can see this consistent downward trend all the way out to the end of fourth gear, where the oil pressure is holding at about 60 psi. The oil pump is crank driven, which means that its speed is directly proportional to crankshaft speed. So you would expect that as RPM increases, the pump would pump more oil, which in theory is the case. The hypothesis is that given these sustained high engine speeds, oil flowing through the high pressure bypass continues to circulate, air is introduced, and the oil begins to foam. And this foamed oil ends up back in the oil pan, recirculating, and as the run goes, the amount of air in the oil continues to increase, and therefore pressure continues to drop. Now, let's compare this with a run with the updated oil pump. So again, this is with the new oil pump. We see here down at idle speeds, oil pressure over 90 psi at idle. Up on the launch control, we see that it comes up to that flat line at 150 psi. Now, right here is where I launch the car and the run initiates. And you do see that immediately the oil pressure goes into some oscillation and some movement from its high point. Now, normally this would be a concern, but because oil pressure we're departing from is nearly 150 psi, this drop, although it looks significant, only brings us down into the 90 psi range. And we see as G-forces stabilize, it starts to climb its way back up over 100 pounds of pressure. Now, even given these swings in oil pressure, given the fact that the pressure is still so high, it doesn't cause much concern for the bearings and losing that fluid film. Now, this was an aborted run, so unfortunately I only got to the top of what looks like second gear here, but you can see that by that point pressure was beginning to climb up again, up to 112 psi here at the top of the gear. So a significant difference, nearly double the oil pressure down the track than the OEM pump under similar conditions and same temperatures. In an application like this, where I can afford some of the increased parasitic draw of pumping oil at significantly higher pressure, this trade-off for improved reliability is worthwhile to me. But it doesn't truly address the core issues with the oiling system in the LS platform. That's to say that despite the higher bypass pressure and larger oil volume moved, it's still susceptible to the same aeration issues. I do believe this is still a worthwhile upgrade. It remains significantly cheaper, simpler, and easier to implement than a full dry sump system. So it's definitely something to consider as an intermediary step, and it might get you all the way to your goals. In this case, it fully fulfilled everything I needed to do, but I'm still curious to experiment a bit more and test some other theories. Let me know your thoughts on the results of it, and if you enjoyed this type of video, consider subscribing to see some more. Thank you.